Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we are headed back to the Smithsonian National Museum of History to continue on with The Price of Freedom, Americans at War exhibit to talk about the next major conflict for the United States, the Cold and Korean War. When World War II ended in 1945, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. After many years of devastating global conflict, the Allied victory marked the end of fascist regimes in Germany and Italy and the collapse of Imperial Japan. But while the war was over, peace remained fragile and a new kind of struggle was already beginning to take shape. The United States had emerged from World War II as one of two dominant superpowers alongside the Soviet Union. Although these nations had been allies in wartime, they were never truly ideologically aligned. One championed democratic capitalism, the other communism. What followed was a tense, prolonged period of geopolitical rivalry that would shape global affairs for nearly half of a century. This was known as the Cold War. Back home in the United States, the post-war years were filled with dramatic changes. Millions of veterans returned from overseas, eager to rebuild their lives and start families. The economy boomed, spurred by pent-up consumer demand, a surge in manufacturing, and government programs like the GI Bill. Suburbs expanded, cars filled the highways, televisions became household staples, and a distinct American middle class began to take shape. But just beneath the surface of this growing prosperity were undercurrents of anxiety and fear. The Soviet Union had seized control of much of Eastern Europe and was expanding its influence globally. By 1949, it had successfully tested its own atomic bomb, ending America's brief monopoly on nuclear power. That same year, China's Communist Revolution brought another major nation into the Soviet orbit. The ideological battle lines were becoming clearer and more dangerous. For many Americans, this was a deeply unsettling time. The fear of communist infiltration led to a wave of suspicion and surveillance at home, often referred to as the Red Scare. Abroad, the U.S. adopted a policy of containment, trying to prevent the further spread of communism even if it meant military intervention. The first major flashpoint in this global standoff came in 1950, when North Korea forces, backed by the Soviet Union and later by Communist China, crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. The United States, under the banner of the newly formed United Nations, responded swiftly, committing troops to defend South Korea and resist the advance of communism in Eastern Asia. This was the beginning of the Korean War, a brutal, often overlooked conflict that would last for 3 years, cost the lives of more than 36,000 American service members, and end in a stalemate that still divides the Korean peninsula to this day. The Korean War was not just a regional conflict, it was a test case for Cold War doctrine and a preview of the global struggle that would define the second half of the 20th century. So in today's video, we are stepping into the next chapter of Americans at War, a chapter that moves away from the conventional warfare of World War II and into a new kind of battle, one fought not only with guns and bombs, but with ideologies, alliances, and the ever-present threat of nuclear escalation. This is the Cold War, and it begins in earnest in Korea. A growing post-war rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union led to a global competition known as the Cold War. The standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union started after World War II, when President Harry Truman defined the conflict as freedom and capitalism versus totalitarianism and communism. He set the precedent for a policy of containment, bolstering any ally who stood in the way of Soviet expansion. Through the Marshall Plan, he provided $12 billion in humanitarian aid to Western Europe, then struggling with post-war recovery. And when the Soviets attempted to blockade West Berlin, Truman launched an airlift that ferried supplies to the beleaguered city until the Soviets backed down. In 1947, the United States reorganized its military and intelligence forces. As the Cold War with the Soviet Union began, the United States centralized the control and coordination of its military and intelligence services. The National Security Act of 1947 created a cabinet-level Secretary of Defense to oversee the departments of the Army and Navy and a newly independent Department of the Air Force. A civilian secretary administered each department, and a formally established Joint Chiefs of Staff, composed of the service heads of each branch, acted as military advisors. The act also created the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Council. The explosion of a Soviet atomic bomb added impetus to government investigations of subversives and anti-communist panic. In 1950, the United States revealed that spies had been passing secrets about its atomic weapons program to the Soviet Union for nearly a decade, giving the Soviets, in the words of their weapons programs chief, exactly what we have been missing. The Federal Bureau of Investigation arrested Klaus Fuchs, a Manhattan Project physicist, and several others, including Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were executed in 1953 for conspiracy to commit espionage. The legitimate search for spies evolved into a witch hunt led by Senator Joseph McCarthy for communists and other disloyal Americans. In 1949, the Cold War became a nuclear arms race when the Soviets detonated an atomic bomb. United States military and intelligence services knew that the Soviets were developing an atomic bomb, but assumed it would be years in the future. They were shocked when air monitoring stations in Alaska detected positive radioactive evidence of a recent explosion, a Soviet atomic test that occurred on August 29, 1949. The American public was stunned. In an understatement, a secret report prepared by the Pentagon noted, "The United States has lost its capability of making an effective atomic attack upon the war-making potential of the USSR without danger of retaliation in kind." In 1952, the United States detonated a thermonuclear hydrogen bomb. Within a year, so did the Soviet Union. In January of 1950, 5 months after the Soviet Union successfully exploded an atomic bomb, President Harry Truman authorized the development of a thermonuclear superbomb, a device 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. A secret study prepared for the president warned that if the Soviets were to develop an H-bomb before the Americans, the risks of Soviet pressure against all the free world or an attack against the United States would be greatly increased. The United States went to war to contain communist expansion fostered by the Soviet Union. After Japan surrendered Korea at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States agreed to oversee separate occupation zones. When North Korean forces poured into South Korea on June 25, 1950, President Harry Truman interpreted the invasion as an attempt by Moscow to expand its domain and test Western resolve. He committed American troops and rallied support in the United Nations, establishing a coalition of 16 nations to mount a counterattack. 3 years of brutal fighting left Americans divided over the war. An uneasy truce split the Korean peninsula into a communist North and a democratic South. North Korean leader Kim Il-sung launched the invasion of South Korea in an attempt to reunify the nation under communism. The Soviets supported his decision with economic and military aid. A few months later, when their border was threatened, the communist Chinese joined the fight as well, sending more than 1 million troops. When North Korean troops crossed the 38th parallel, the two countries' dividing line, South Korean troops scattered in disarray and civilians streamed south. U.S. reinforcements initially failed to stem the tide, and the North Koreans pushed the coalition allies into the southeast corner of the peninsula near Busan. These are fleeing South Korean civilians. On summer days in Korea, temperatures often topped 110 degrees Fahrenheit and humidity hovered at 90% or higher. In this display is a summer cap, a model 1941 summer fatigue jacket and trousers, surplus items from World War II, as were most of the uniforms and equipment used in Korea, summer combat boots, and a .30 caliber US M1 rifle. During bitter winters in Korea, temperatures often dropped below -30 Fahrenheit. So many troops suffered frostbite during the first winter of the war that the Army redesigned its cold weather equipment. Here we have a hat with wool ear protectors, a model 1951 winter field jacket and trousers, a pile jacket worn under the field jacket, and winter combat boots. Summers in Korea were intolerably hot and humid. Troops tried in vain to stay cool and dry. Even at rest, they could be soaked in sweat, muddied and waterlogged from slogging through rice paddies, or drenched in monsoon rains. These are U.S. Marines in South Korea. In Korea, traditionally known as Chosun winters were brutal with fierce winds, stinging sleet, drifting snow, and frozen ground. Soldiers bundled up, often using their ponchos for shelter, but the cold was penetrating. "You get cold to the bone," recalled an American soldier. "It's hard to thaw out." This soldier is from the 19th Infantry Regiment in January 1951. Airborne infantry were inserted behind enemy lines to conduct espionage, take airfields, and engage enemy forces. In Korea, the Fairchild C-119 flying boxcar dropped troops, supplies, and heavy equipment including trucks, artillery, and even bridge spans. These paratroopers are from the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team. As rival armies pushed each other up and down the Korean peninsula, President Truman stood his ground. North Korean armies drove South Korean and U.S. troops into the peninsula's southern reaches. Then UN forces under the command of Douglas MacArthur turned the tide and battled their way north, pushing North Korean troops to the Yalu River. A ferocious Chinese counteroffensive drove UN troops south again. Meanwhile, General MacArthur and President Truman came to a standoff. At issue was the popular general's repeated defiance of the civilian president. In 1951, when MacArthur lobbied to expand the war into China, even at the risk of world war, Truman fired him. President Harry Truman, in Plain Speaking by Merle Miller in 1974, recorded, "I fired him because he wouldn't respect the authority of the president. That's the answer to that. I didn't fire him because he was a dumb son of a bitch, although he was, but that's not against the law for generals. If it was, half to three-fourths of them would be in jail." General Douglas MacArthur said in 1951, "It seems strangely difficult for some to realize that here in Asia is where the communist conspirators have elected to make their play for global conquest. We must win. There is no substitute for victory." Some U.S. troops carried small banners with pictographs that identified them as UN forces. If they were separated from their units, they could show the banners to non-English speaking locals to ask for assistance. Many of the banners, modeled after official blood chits that promised rewards in exchange for the safe return of downed pilots, were produced for sale to American GIs by enterprising South Korean artisans. Here is a banner carried by Corporal George Munson, U.S. Marine Corps in 1950. Late in 1950, the U.S. Air Force began to deploy fighter jets in Korea. Flying from aircraft carriers and bases, the nimble jets provided air superiority against enemy aircraft and support for ground troops. Coalition jets clashed with communist-piloted MiG fighters in airspace nicknamed MiG Alley along the Yalu River. This is an F-86 Sabre, the Air Force's first swept wing, which was aerodynamically superior to a straight-wing jet fighter. While UN forces prepared to push north from Busan, U.S. troops made a daring amphibious landing at the port of Incheon in September of 1950. They poured onto the beach, then threatened the enemy from behind. The North Koreans retreated north rather than risk being trapped in a closing vise. These are landing ship tanks known as LSTs unloading on the beach at Incheon. Soviet and American scientists and engineers raced to develop long-range ballistic missiles with payloads that could not be intercepted. Cold War planners on both sides recognized the strategic importance of rocket-launched nuclear warheads that could reach a distant continent. Engineers and technicians worked on propulsion and guidance systems for intercontinental ballistic missiles known as ICBMs. In 1957, the Soviets tested the first successful ICBM, then used it to launch a small satellite, the Sputnik, into Earth's orbit. The United States sent a satellite of its own aloft a few months later, using a smaller mid-range missile as a launch vehicle. The first U.S. ICBM was deployed in 1959. As the two rivals faced to outmatch each other, their nuclear arsenals grew. The United States successfully launched its first ICBM, the Atlas, in 1959. Equipped with nuclear warheads, the missiles could travel more than 6,000 miles. Soon they were replaced by more accurate Minutemen missiles that were quicker to launch and propelled by solid fuel. After World War II, both the United States and the Soviet Union used captured German technology and the expertise of relocated German scientists to jumpstart their rocket programs. Germany had developed the first liquid-fueled rockets in the 1930s and launched more than 1,300 V-2 rockets against London during the war. In 1957, the Soviet R-7 was the world's first IBM, a ballistic missile that could travel an intercontinental distance, 3,000 miles or more, along a suborbital trajectory. The liquid-fueled launch vehicle had inertial and radio-controlled guidance systems and carried a warhead in a heat-shielded re-entry pad. To prepare the public for potential nuclear attacks, the federal government conducted an elaborate civil defense campaign. A hydrogen bomb dropped on Washington, D.C. would destroy everything within 3 miles of the Capitol and unleash deadly radioactive fallout. Little could be done to protect the public in the event of an attack on any targeted city. But federal officials held out the hope of survival, encouraging Americans to ready fallout shelters and practice duck and cover drills in school. In 1955, the Civil Defense Administration staged the first of several nationwide drills in which schools and workplaces, even the White House, were evacuated in response to mock nuclear attacks. Public fallout shelters in sturdy municipal buildings with windowless hallways or basements were stocked with canned water and food, blankets, and chemical toilets. The possibility of protection helped prevent public panic. These are Junior Civil Defense Club members. Here is a light table used by Central Intelligence Agency analysts to examine film from reconnaissance flights by spy planes over Cuba, and overhead is an image of a U-2 spy plane. The standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union over nuclear missiles in Cuba was a turning point in the Cold War. When President John F. Kennedy learned that the Soviet Union was deploying nuclear missiles in Cuba, he demanded they be withdrawn and indicated his willingness to risk nuclear war if they were not. U.S. ships blockaded Cuba. B-52 bombers loaded with nuclear weapons flew in holding patterns just beyond Soviet airspace, ready to attack. The crisis abated only when the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles and the United States quietly removed similar medium-range missiles from Turkey. In the aftermath of the face-off, the superpowers continued to develop nuclear weapons but also sought ways to avoid a nuclear exchange. Clockwise from upper left is a B-52 Stratofortress, a newspaper headline from October 23, 1962, 2 missile sites in Cuba, the USS Essex heading to blockade Cuba, and President Kennedy addressing the nation. Determined to stop communist expansion, the United States became increasingly involved in Southeast Asia. During World War II, the United States supported Vietnamese nationalist Ho Chi Minh in his struggle against the Japanese. But after the war, when he sought assistance from communist powers to win independence from France, the United States opposed him as an agent of communist expansion. A 1954 ceasefire agreement partitioned the country into a communist North and an anti-communist South. President Dwight Eisenhower sent military advisors and $1 billion to support South Vietnam. President John F. Kennedy increased the number of advisors and tripled U.S. financial support. The stage was set for yet another war. Here we have President John F. Kennedy speaking to the nation in 1961, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and American officials in South Vietnam in 1964, and General Paul D. Harkins, first commander of the U.S. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. And that concludes the Cold and Korean portions of the Americans at War exhibit. The Cold War era was not just about tension, it was also about transformation. The Korean War marked a significant turning point as it was the first major military conflict of the Cold War and one of the first times American troops were deployed not to conquer or liberate territory, but to contain an ideology, to stop the spread of communism in a far-off region that few Americans had ever even heard of before 1950. Though the Korean War never officially ended and the peninsula remains divided to this day, the U.S. viewed the conflict as a demonstration of its global resolve. The stakes were no longer regional, they were existential. Back home, the aftermath of Korea left the country conflicted. The war did not end in victory or celebration, it ended in a stalemate. American soldiers came home to a nation that largely wanted to forget. There were no parades, no major memorials. But behind the scenes, the lessons of Korea were already reshaping American foreign policy. Our leaders became more convinced than ever that the United States had to remain vigilant, ready to respond to any challenge from communism no matter where it emerged. That mindset, the policy of containment, would soon take the United States into yet another conflict, one that would be longer, bloodier, and far more divisive at home. A conflict that didn't just test our military strategy, but tested the very soul of the American public. That conflict was the Vietnam War. As we close this chapter on the Cold and Korean Wars, we step into one of the most complex periods in modern American history. In tomorrow's video, we'll explore how the seeds planted during the Cold War years would grow into a full-blown conflict in Southeast Asia, one that would change the nation's ideals, its leadership, and the will of its people like never before. If you're still here, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll be back tomorrow for the Vietnam War.